our opening remarks for the day, for today. And I'm really pleased and honored to introduce Henk Oving, Special Envoy for Water from the Netherlands. He's a person who needs very little introduction to probably most of you who have worked in water, but for those of you who haven't met him, he's a very inspiring and important thinker in this space. So we're delighted to have him give us some inspiration to start the day. And Henk, without further ado, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you to the OECD and the World Bank, World Water Council, our partners, ADB and others from around the world for again a roundtable on financing water. I don't need to tell you how important it is that we talk about finance and water, and especially in the times of climate change where those impacts only increase. But I think it also doesn't hurt to reiterate and rephrase again many of those messages. And we know the climate crisis is a water crisis. Climate hits us hardest through water, too much, too little, but also too polluted. And we come out of 1.5 years of pandemic, even a little bit more, where every world leader, every CEO, every community leader said, wash your hands. But we weren't able to bridge the gap on wash at all. We still have 2, 3, and 4 billion people lacking access to safe drinking water, hygiene facilities, and sanitation. So even a crisis like the COVID crisis did not help to understand better that that need for wash and the urgency of water is critical important for the safety and well-being of people and the environment and our economy. Second, we lose trillions when it comes to the damage of water. And we know floods have an immediate impact, but droughts have a trickling down impact in years ahead, losing GDP by the big numbers. So understanding those interdependencies of the values of water in our economy, society, our environment, and culture are of critical importance. 2023, that might sound like an abstract number, but it's actually 2 years from now, a little less. For the second time in the history of the United Nations, for the first time since 1977, we will have a summit on water. And that means that we will bring the world together on water. So that is not water people talking about water at the UN headquarters. No, it's a process of engagement and outreach of the next 1.5 years, where we want to bring everybody from finance, from environment, from any other sector, any institution, as well as in the most informal, most marginalized indigenous knowledge and capacity from around the world together to raise that voice on water, but also understand what is this gap? How can we bridge it? What is a necessary commitment of all partners around the world to make sure that we take a step forward? And what does it then mean for the conference itself? A conference where we bring the world together, what type of commitments should we make? And also, how does a process after such a conference, the implementation, the execution, the replication and scaling of best examples look like? The Netherlands is honored to be co-chair of this second ever UN UN 23 Water Conference, together with Tajikistan. We're supported by UN DESA and UN Water as a secretariat, but we count on the world to join us in this massive effort. Last, I refer to not the latest IPCC report, but the IPCC report from 2019, which is called Climate Change and Land. And in the context of financing water, I think that is of critical importance to reread that report. It has 2 foundational pillars. One, it says that over 99% of all our investments increase climate change. And second, how we invest, where and how, makes us more vulnerable because we do it in the wrong way and in the wrong places, destroying our biodiversity, our environment that actually could help build sustainability and resilience. So changing course is not focusing on adjusting the 99%, because that won't get us on track. Changing course means understanding that 1% that does make a difference and find mechanisms, partnerships, coalitions, and innovations to help scale and replicate that 1 to 3 to 9 to and so forth. That is what this roundtable can also be about. How can we understand and what do we need to organize to make sure that that 1% becomes the mainstream, the next normal? Part of that is on adaptation, nature-based solutions and innovations. Part of it is about governance and finance and data. And part of it is about finding safe and soft spaces, the opportunity to innovate. A program like Water as Leverage, where we find room to bring financial partners, local communities, and international and national organizations and governments together to understand that 1%, build business cases around them, and find methodologies to scale them up. I look forward to the conversation. I really think that we can strengthen our capacity together, focusing not on the past, not on the things that led us to where we are today, that might, by replication, lead us to more failure, but really focusing on the future, being inspired by the SDGs and the Paris Agreement in such a way that that type of capacity is transformative and helps us deliver on the promises we made. Thanks so much for your commitment and your partnership. I really look forward to you all joining us towards 2023 and beyond, and really look forward to hear all your ideas in today's conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Henk. Great way to get us started with very inspiring remarks and setting out a vision for how important it is to really appreciate the value of water, and reminding us also that it's not just how much we invest, but also the how and the where that will really deliver the impact. Let me now turn to our second high-level remarks to get us started in these discussions today, and turning to Franz Rojas, who is the Water Agenda Coordinator at CAP. He's also the chair of the Task Force on Financing at the World Water Council, and he will also be known to many of you. He's been a very steadfast supporter, working with us in the context of the roundtable and finding ways to move forward this agenda on financing water. So Franz, over to you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. On behalf of the World Water Council, where CAF is part, I'm very delighted to be part of this new edition on the Roundtable on Financing Water, which has the aim to promote knowledge to scale up finance that contributes to water security and to climate action. I see members from the water community and also from the financial community, and then it's important to set the scene a little bit. And as Henk said, climate crisis is water crisis. Many of the impacts of climate change manifests through the hydrological cycle. In fact, water is the primary medium through which we see the effects of climate change. Water availability is becoming less predictable, increased variability and intensity of rainfall, and reduced snowpack feeding headwaters of major rivers. Also, increased incidences of flooding threaten to destroy or affect water sources, and droughts in turn threaten the overall food systems, especially irrigation lands, with externalities that deepen levels of poverty and unemployment while also forcing migration. In this scenario, water investments to manage such impacts can make direct contributions to climate adaptation and resilience. In addition, improved management of water services and fresh water ecosystems can also contribute to climate mitigation while delivering benefits for water security. For instance, improve energy efficiency of water services, or reduce non-revenue water, or the promotion of circular economy and wastewater reuse and using or harnessing byproducts can contribute to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Water investments in that direction can make key contributions as part of net zero pathways and targets. Hence, this roundtable on financing is key to increase disclosure and establish a sort of roadmap to inform the outcomes in forthcoming fora, such as the 9th World Water Forum to be held in 6 months more in Dakar, Senegal. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to listen to experts discussing on the interlinkages between water security and climate change action, and how to align finance with both. And blended finance was one of the hot topics, we would say, because we all see real opportunities to crowd in commercial investment. And we understand blended finance structures are associated with reducing risk and or enhancing return. But we also know this instrument is scarcely used in the water sector compared to the energy or agricultural sector, for instance. And then we share the same interest. That is why, let me briefly tell you what we are doing at the Task Force on Financing with members of the World Water Council, such as CAF, TNC, SABESPI, FAO, and others, to pursue on the tradition of the Council to deal on the water sector finance. We are working on a piece of work on blended finance based on a systematization of many cases already published to structure common attributes to contribute to a better understanding on complexities, but also opportunities for upscaling blended finance. Some attributes are domestic liquidity and or international liquidity, project preparation and capacity development, revenue diversification, sovereign underwriting, multi-tier credit enhancements and protections, and so on. And just to give you an example, revenue diversification contribute to reduce this risk while also increase return. Another way to reduce risk is through the borrower's obligations being underwritten by credible guarantors. Nevertheless, as discussed yesterday, it does not currently work for all. We see that transaction costs, as discussed yesterday, can be a hindrance for upscaling, especially to local governments or mid-sized utilities. Another piece of work is on financing nature-based solutions. We're working as part of the task force. As we all know, nature-based solutions can generate multiple co-benefits for carbon, diversity, human health, and green job creation. The report we're working is aimed at public and private investors with particular focus on the latter to highlight main types of investment in nature-based solutions for water security and how investors can support investments through blended finance structures. And blended finance and the ability to expand has a close relation to financial materiality of a risk due to environmental risks, or more accurately, water-related risks, and their impact on financial portfolios. And we believe that today we will have the opportunity to discuss a little bit on that. Last but not least, as said, in the forthcoming March, we will celebrate the 9th World Water Forum in Dakar, Senegal, that will connect and link to global agendas and commitments related to SDGs, the Sendai Agreement on Disasters, and the Paris Agreement on Climate. Interesting to mention that the forum has been structured in 4 priorities, and governance, financing, and technology innovation are under the umbrella of means and tools priority, with a rich and challenging agenda to discuss. For instance, the role of public development banks in supporting developing countries to achieve SDG 6 and NDC targets. We plan also to have sessions on innovative structuring approaches comprising, of course, blended finance and experiences on financing nature-based solutions as part of climate actions. This roundtable on financing with a special focus on climate action may inform a high-level session at this World Water Forum and other international fora as well. Hence, I extend on behalf of the Council an invitation to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franz. I mean, really excellent remarks, reminding us of some of these emerging issues around financing, the blended finance, the nature-based solutions, other topics linking to financial materiality. You did a great job to set up, I think, the discussion for today. And also thank you for the invitation to the 9th World Water forum. I know that many people are looking forward to that. So excellent to have you here today. Thank you for that. I'd like to now go ahead and pass over to our chair for session 3, our first session for today. That's Dr. Simon Buckle. He's the head of our division working on environment, transitions, and resilience in the Environment Directorate at the OECD. And Simon, without further ado, over to you.
Many thanks indeed, Kathleen. I hope everybody can hear me well. And just to underline, the thanks to the 2 opening speakers, Henk and Frans, for their inspirational remarks. I think that was a great start. And importantly, also for their partnership in the context of the roundtable itself, which is really very much appreciated. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to moderate the 3rd session. It's going to focus on the materiality of water-related risks for the financial sector. And this is one of the core issues across the division and across the program that we work on at the OECD, in a sense. And we brought together the resilience and water agendas, a few years ago, precisely because we saw this amplified on the agenda and the importance of the issue as such that we really need a coherent approach across these silos. And if we can't do it in the OECD, what hope is there of doing it in the real world? So what we're going to try to do in this session is really to focus on the materiality of water-related risks, as our opening speaker, Frans, said. And this comes in diverse forms. We'll hear more from Frank Elderson on this in the keynote, but the key risk, of course, is first a physical risk that stems from climate change, from complex changes to the hydrological cycle, as well as existing variability, of course. And then we often forget also about sea level rise and increasing average temperatures, which are also going to impact. It's not just the extremes here that we're worried about. And, the storm surge on top of a sea level rise, can lead to salination of aquifers and these sorts of issues. And of course, we know the intensity of many extreme events that had adverse impacts are going to increase, in frequency a lot. And you will, I'm sure, have looked at the IPCC's AR6 Working Group 1 report, which has some really interesting and nice diagrams on how the frequency of some of these extreme events will change. And then there are also transition risks due to changes in policies and regulations, might be in the water sector, allocation or pricing, or the regulation of water use. And this is going to have a significant effect on underlying assets, productive assets, all along the supply chain. We might even get some upside risks if we're lucky. Climate mitigation policies might, for example, encourage greater nitrogen use efficiency, maybe less diffuse pollution, and so on. One thing that is often forgotten are the liability risks. And we're thinking, in terms of what are the risks for the financial sector. Well, because the financial sector and the corporate sector are having impacts on the water, on water quantity and quality, that also brings about a liability risk. They might be taken to court, they might be subject to all sorts of difficulties. And this is a risk for companies far beyond the water sector, from a range of different sectors as well. And you just got to think about, contaminants of emerging concern, microplastics, antibiotics, to think about some of the challenges we will face from the rest of the economy, not just focusing on the water sector itself. So we think that a lot of these risks are not really being considered adequately under prevailing regulations and approaches. And while there are a large number of financial institutions that say that the potential impact on their portfolios of environmental risks deserves a much deeper investigation, only a few have really got an approach in place to do that. And so there is really an urgent need to understand this better, to understand the impact of climate and other environmental risks on financial portfolios, and to increase disclosure and transparency. We've seen, the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. We've seen also the launch of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures for biodiversity-related risks. And of course, the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy takes an integrated approach across the range of risks, though it started with climate mitigation and a bit on adaptation, but is moving forward. And that's just a starting point. There's a huge amount still to be done. We're going to hear from diverse perspectives on what the challenges are and how this is going to be done, from a central bank, from a credit rating agency, a government budget office, and a private investor. And I think I should shut up and turn to them. So I'd just say that it's my great pleasure to invite Frank Elderson to give some keynote remarks here. And Frank has been the Vice Chair of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank since 2021. And since 2020, he's also been a member of the Executive Board of the ECB and oversees the ECB's legal services. Before that, 2018 to 2020, he was a member of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and from 2014 to 18, a member for the EU Single Resolution Board. Previously served as the Executive Director for the Dutch Central Bank, and was on its governing board, joined its governing board in 2011. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some insights on the ECB's recent work on these risks, and what implications that has for the risk profile of the financial sector. So please, without any further delay, Frank, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Great pleasure to be here. Thanks also to you, Kathleen, and it's wonderful to speak after Henk and Frans, and I will try to live up to the standard that they have set for this session. So many thanks. Allow me to thank in particular the OECD, the US Department of State, and the US Environmental Protection Agency for taking the initiative for organizing this meeting focused on climate action. And this is indeed very timely in view of the upcoming COP26 conference in November. In addition to all the things that you've already mentioned, Simon, and that I will not repeat, I'm also chairing the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or the NGFS as we refer to it. And this is a coalition of the willing that brings together now 95 central banks and supervisors from around the world. Starting with 8 4 years ago, now it's 95 central banks and supervisors, observers like the IMF, the BIS, World Bank. So that is one perspective that I bring to the table. Now, moreover, as a Dutchman, and of course, Henk is here as well, I come from a place where below zero central banking and supervision has been practiced already for over 200 years, and not below zero level of interest rates, I now mean, but below zero elevation relative to sea level, even when you are located on the first or maybe even the second floor of the central bank. Now, having lived and worked for most of my life in the Netherlands has made me well aware of both the risks and the opportunities that come from water. And an insight that I'm very happy to see featuring prominently in the work of the ECB and the NGFS on how climate change and environmental degradation may impact our surroundings, and as a consequence, our economy and financial system. Now, let me illustrate this by mentioning some of the broader activities that the ECB is currently undertaking with respect to climate and environmental considerations. First, in November of last year, the ECB Banking Supervision published a supervisory guide on climate-related and environmental risks. And in that guide, we made clear that we expect banks to take a comprehensive, strategic, and forward-looking approach to disclosing and managing all climate-related and environmental risks. And these include, for example, the risks of biodiversity loss, deforestation, but also explicitly water pollution, water stress, and flooding. We have asked banks to conduct a self-assessment relating to the expectations that we have set out in that guide, and to draw up action plans on how they intend to comply with these expectations. This supervisory exercise has begun with, but will not be limited to, taking stock of banks' self-assessments. We are now in the process of benchmarking these self-assessments and action plans, and will then challenge them as part of our ongoing supervision along all dimensions of our expectations. The preliminary results show that no bank, as of yet, no bank has the full picture on climate and environmental risks. None of the banks under our supervision meet all our expectations. But the good news is that many pieces of the climate and environmental risk puzzle can already be found scattered around the banking union. Almost all banks have developed implementation plans, and many have started to progressively improve their practices. The progress that we have identified can be observed in banks from different countries with different business models and different asset volumes. And this confirms that what we are asking for can be done. The ECB will see to it that every bank is making expeditious progress in embedding climate and environmental risks into their institution by following up with supervisory requirements where needed. This supervisory exercise will also offer banks a strong incentive to bolster their ability to identify and quantify their exposures to climate and environmental risks and their tolerance to these risks. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this exercise, we are reviewing plans covering 24 trillion euros worth of banking assets. In addition, next year, ECB banking supervision will conduct a supervisory stress test with a focus on climate-related risks, for which a methodology will soon be shared with banks under our supervision. The methodology will build on similar earlier exercises and work done by the NGFS, in particular the climate scenarios that the NGFS has developed in collaboration with academics and research institutes around the world. These scenarios have truly become an industry standard, and they help in ensuring consistency across exercises of different natures and in different jurisdictions. And while they have been developed for use by central banks and supervisors, they may also be useful to governments, academia, and private sector firms. With these scenarios, the NGFS provides, and by the way, intends to regularly update in the future, an important public good for all stakeholders, public and private, to help them engage in forward-looking climate risk analysis under a common and consistent global reference framework. Whatever a scenario transpires, we can only effectively manage the associated combination of physical and transition risks if all stakeholders have considered what possible outcomes imply for their respective mandate or their respective business strategy. Among the physical risks considered in the different scenarios, water-related risks such as an increased incidence of heavy precipitation, water stress, and risks of flooding play an important part. As a consequence, these mechanisms will feature prominently in any stress test exercise inspired by the scenarios produced by the NGFS, including the ECB's supervisory exercise next year that I referred to earlier. Another concrete example of this type of work by the ECB was released earlier this week when we published the results from our macro stress test. Different from next year's supervisory exercise that I just alluded to, this was a top-down exercise relying on data, assumptions, and models developed by ECB staff, but also building on the work done by the NGFS. It was a granular exercise relying on counterparty level climate and financial information collected from millions, actually 4 million, over 4 million plus, I think even, companies to which euro area banks are exposed via loans and securities holdings. To the best of our knowledge, this data collection is the most comprehensive set of backward and forward-looking climate and financial information available to a central bank today. The results of the analysis show that the short-term costs of a green transition pale in comparison to the costs of unfettered climate change in the medium to long term. The costs of a transition are always more than compensated by long-term benefits in terms of investing in sustainable technologies. By contrast, if policies on transitioning towards a greener economy are not introduced, physical risks become increasingly higher over time. It is thus of the utmost importance to transition early and gradually to mitigate the costs of both the green transition and the future impact of natural disasters. The results of this exercise show that the impacts of climate-related and environmental risk on average will increase moderately until 2050 if climate change is not mitigated. And they are concentrated in some geographical areas. Exposure to water-related risks play an important role in this latter outcome, with Southern European countries particularly affected by water stress, and Middle to North European countries mostly affected by flood risk. This exemplifies that we need to have very clear understanding of how climate and environmental risks might materialize to deepen our understanding of the underlying risks. Ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude. Central banks and supervisors are connecting the dots. And in the process, they will urge and see to it that financial institutions do the same. Always within our mandate, but unconstrained across dimensions along which physical and transition risks of the climate and environmental crises may materialize. Because this is the task of the financial system and its supervisors and regulators, to ensure that all material risks are managed. And water is an integral part of the physical risks coming from climate and environmental change, and of the opportunities coming from our ambition to transition to sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. And I mean, that was fantastic to hear. And just had to sort of pinch myself to check you were from the Environment Ministry, but there we go. That's really, really important work that's going to, I think, transform perceptions of the importance of the financial risks from climate and other environmental risks, and how these are going to spill over, as you say, so clearly into the risks faced by countries across Europe and the world. And you know, in many ways, Europe will have extreme stresses from drying in the south, but there's going to be a lot of unpredictable change and a lot of very severe hazards that you know, we really don't anticipate and understand fully yet. The models that we use to model these things are often too smooth. Who would have thought that we'd have had Lytton in North Canada 4.6 degrees higher than its most extreme temperature ever recorded previously at 45 degrees, going to 49.6 degrees, almost touching 50 degrees in British Columbia. And that was just came out of nowhere. So I think, you know, there's a real precautionary element as well to this, but that's really great to hear. Thank you very much. And now I want to turn to our other three speakers, going to provide some different insights from three different perspectives. And if I may turn first to Marie Deterring, she's going to provide some insights from her work at Moody's on the potential impacts of physical climate risks on credit risks and the need for forward-looking climate projections to understand how these may evolve in the future. Now, since April 2020, Marie's been the Managing Director of Sovereign Risk Group for Moody's Investors Service and has got a long background there. Previously, Director at Oxford Economics, and you know, has also spent a number of years at other institutions, including the ECB, I understand. So a connection there. So over to you, Marie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone really for inviting us to contribute. I really look forward to learning from all the experts around the room. As Simon said, I wanted to spend a few minutes just to explain to you how, as a rating agency, we are looking at these risks, and we are, and increasingly so, and increasingly formally so. I think that is important. It is a research effort and an analytical effort that we have started for some time. But the acceleration in the formalization of that analysis has been really quite something very pleasing to see in the last couple of years. So when we look at water risks or water as a source of credit risks, we look at it in two main ways, and the keynote speakers have mentioned these two ways already. One is water management risk, and I was very interested to hear that it does feature here in this conversation, because sometimes I think in the financial community it can get forgotten. The risks, very basic, essential risks related to water supply and quality of water. Then, of course, we also look at, not less important at all, the risks related to climate change and the water-related manifestations of climate change through floods, droughts, and rising sea levels. And this is part of a classification of ESG risks that we use to look at the credit impact of these various risk factors across sectors. So for financial institutions, as well as corporates, as well as governments. We actually revised our classification just last year on the environmental side to highlight the water management risk as an integral category of risk, because we felt that there were drivers of this and potential solutions, mitigation actions that were somewhat different from the part that we want to continue to watch under a climate change rubric. So now, in terms of how we do this, with that classification in mind, if I start with the physical climate change aspect of this analysis, we are lucky to benefit from expert inputs from 427, a Moody's affiliate, and 427 gives us projections out to 40, 50 years that highlight the degree of the intensity of risk for economic activity, population, agriculture, around various extreme weather natural hazards, so including the water-related natural hazards. And we get that at a country level, at a regional level, at a fine city level, as well as at the level of a corporate location, the production, the operations locations of a corporate. So that tells us about really the exposure to, in the case of the topic today, to water-related stress, and which we combine with an assessment of sensitivity. And sensitivity is really, given the fabric of the economy, the sectoral composition of the economy, given the strength of the infrastructure, the quality of the infrastructure, the strength of the healthcare sector, then should there be a natural disaster, then what is likely to be the impact? And you can easily think of two countries at kind of similar locations in the world, so exposed to similar weather phenomena, but one is agriculture dependent and the other is, say, 100% IT services, then the former is likely to be a lot more sensitive to climate change than the latter. And so we do need to take that into account. We also factor in, and at this stage it is largely qualitative, but the mitigation measures. And again, we are seeing a lot of thinking, and that's really one area where I think there's a lot more to do to understand what is likely to be effective to mitigate these risks. But to the extent possible, we factor this in on the basis of our discussions with governments, with corporates, with financial institutions. And so what we find is that around across the countries that we rate, 50, are what we call highly or very highly exposed to physical climate risk. That's notch number 4 and 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. So it's really very much at that high end of the spectrum. And that's an assessment that denotes for us that economic activity, for government's fiscal strength, for corporate profitability and capacity, ultimately capacity to repay debt is likely to be impaired at some point over time. We look at the experience, the events of natural disasters, and what is interesting to see is that so far countries, we all know of countries being devastated by natural disasters, but they do tend to bounce back. For instance, Fiji is a set of islands in the Pacific that we look at with my team, and was hit by a very heavy cyclone back in 2017. The economy was hit very significantly, cost estimated about 20% of GDP. It did bounce back very quickly. Now, where I agree that sometimes models are too smooth, is that the bounce back happens largely through the mechanisms of international aid and international financial support. And the question we have is whether this will continue to be forthcoming as in when natural disasters, water-based events happen more frequently and more intensively.
I was just going to say, if we can just wrap up very quickly.
So we also look at the chronic aspects. You mentioned rising sea levels, and we do that, and I'm happy to take questions on that if needed. On the water management side, I started with that because I think it's worth highlighting separately. It is a different set of metrics that we want to look at. It is around water endowment, and the solutions, as I said, are likely to be also different around desalination is the choice that some countries take, albeit with a financial and environmental cost, but also some solutions that we see corporate stake, tapping other sources, water, underground sources, as well as really water efficiency measures, which we're seeing across a number of sectors. So overall, we are at a stage where we have, I think, a robust assessment of exposure, different sectors, different economies, where we feel that there's a lot more work and better understanding to do is around the mitigation, around the solutions on all of this. And so I think here I am surrounded by experts, and that's what I look forward to hearing about.
Great. Sorry to hurry you, Marie. That's really great, but we need to move on as well. And I was really struck though by your comments, very, very interesting comments around the international support for the solutions. And I think that's, is going to be a big issue on the agenda at COP26. And we're just on the point actually of finalizing, we hope, a report on how countries will manage the risks and actual losses and damages from climate change, which we hope to launch at COP26. And of course, the numbers that we put out last week on the climate finance, on progress on the climate finance commitment of 100 billion, shows that developed countries were still 20 billion short in 2019 relative to 2020 on the basis of the report. So you're right to have a little bit of concern, I think, for how that's going, and hopefully countries will do more and scale up their action. Certainly, we heard very good news from New York this week, enhanced effort from the US and from also the European Union. So that's very good. So now I want to turn to Brian Rosenthal to deliver some remarks from a government perspective. Brian is a policy analyst in the Budget Review Division of the Office of Management and Budget in the USA. So he's responsible for leading the team that provides budgetary presentations and best practices in relation to the US federal loan and loan guarantee programs, which has a small value of around $5 trillion. So not a tiny job, this one. And I understand you're going to talk about the recent executive order on climate-related financial risk. So over to you, Brian.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction. And also thank you to my colleagues at the EPA and the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to participate today. I'm pleased to be here today and my small children at home to discuss aspects of Executive Order 14030 regarding climate-related financial risks, which were issued by President Biden on May 20th of this year. In particular, my team works with a number of agencies on implementing sections 5A of the Executive Order, or EO, related to financial reporting, and 5C related to integrating climate-related financial risks into particular lending programs. I should note that I'm a career civil servant, and any remarks today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Office of Management and Budget or the administration. While I can discuss publicly available information regarding actions that have been taken in response to the EO and give insights into general applicable policy processes, I won't be able to discuss any internal deliberations today. Just as a bit of background, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, as an institution serves multiple roles, the most prominent of which is helping the president in planning and executing the annual budget process. OMB also helps coordinate policies amongst the numerous departments and agencies, and this is reflected in many parts of the EO. I'll try as best I can to briefly summarize the breadth and scope of the EO, but would encourage you to take a look on the White House website. Oversimplifying a bit, the requirements are, calls for a strategy to measure, assess, mitigate, and disclose climate-related financial risks to the U.S. federal government, as well as financing needs to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Directs the Treasury Secretary to take numerous actions in her own capacity and as chair of the Financial Stability Oversight Council to assess the effects of climate on systemic risks. Calls for the consideration of climate-related risks in the U.S. pension and retirement system. Incorporates greenhouse gas emissions as part of the federal contracting and procurement process. Reestablishes aspects of the federal flood risk management standard. Looks to quantify and incorporate climate risk into the federal budget and accounting processes. And the part which I can discuss a bit more today, Section 5, calls for the incorporation of climate risks into financial management and reporting, especially as related to direct loan and loan guarantee programs, as well as integrating climate risks into the design and policies for loan programs under the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Agriculture, and Veterans Affairs. So Section 5A of the EO covers financial management and financial reporting. With regards to these aspects, the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, or FASAB, which federal agencies follow for financial accounting, held a public meeting in August which discussed climate-related financial risks. They've begun the process of researching various disclosure frameworks under development, agreed to move forward with developing staff implementation guidance pertaining to current standards, and will be researching the need for additional standards for climate-related financial risks. At a staff level, OMB and the Department of Treasury are communicating with FASAB staff to determine next steps. In the same vein, OMB annually issues guidance to agencies to assist them in developing their financial reporting. The fiscal year 2021 guidance, which covers the period ending on September 30th, coming up, for the first time encouraged agencies in their management discussion and analysis to optionally include a discussion of actions taken or planned to address climate-related risks, partially in response to the EO. I'm interested to see how this reporting progresses and whether it becomes more expansive in future years. Section 5C of the EO covers lending programs of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Agriculture, and Veterans Affairs, and it requires them to consider climate risk in underwriting, loan terms and conditions, asset management, and servicing. These three agencies are responsible for $2.4 trillion of the approximately $5 trillion in loans and primary loan guarantees across the US government, and programs to assist in homeownership account for 92% of that $2.4 trillion. While the EO covers climate risk generally, water-related risks such as flooding certainly come to mind, especially when we see numerous studies recently about vulnerabilities in the housing sector. Our mandate is to responsibly manage government credit programs, and our policy officials have sent clear signals that while they expect us to move deliberately and responsibly, those management responsibilities will include responding to climate risk going forward. While I cannot speak to specific internal deliberations, I'd like to share a bit about my own thought process after organizing a few of the meetings of a working group dedicated to this subject. As is probably the case with many of our non-governmental counterparties, a successful policy outcome is best supported by a good policy process with consistent and deliberate management attention from policy officials providing the necessary resources. For policymakers to weigh costs and benefits, we need to arm them with better information to weigh the unmitigated cost of risks, and we need to first identify those risks and develop new ways of quantifying them. We've seen new studies strongly suggesting that those risks are already present. As the background paper to this panel notes, we have reason to believe that future risks will be greater than exists in the historical or recent data set. And while it will not be possible to create perfectly predictive models immediately, the key is to start the hard work now and keep iterating so that we can build the necessary skills, while also explaining the limitations of those models as policy officials consider various interventions and alternatives. While that may not be a satisfying conclusion, it isn't meant to be a conclusion, but rather the start of an ongoing process. I'm pleased to see so many participants at this roundtable, which for me echoes the signal being sent by our policy officials that this process is of vital importance and we better get to work with all deliberate speed. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian, and thank you for keeping to time so well as well. That's appreciated. And I mean, your remarks as well about this getting started and learning and iterating. I think that's just so vital for this. We're in a process of risk management with huge uncertainties. Not about climate change, that's happening. The doctors said we've got the disease. The question is, how's the prognosis going to pan out given the other things like poverty, given geographical locations, given all sorts of other vulnerabilities and exposures. So I think this issue of decision making under uncertainty is going to be something that everybody's going to have to be coping with much more in future. And great to hear you speaking about that. Now, finally, I want to turn to Tim Dunn, and this is last but not least. Tim's going to give us an investor's perspective on the linkages between water risks and financial materiality and how this influences investment decisions. So I'm really fascinated and looking forward to this. Tim's the founder and CIO of Terra Alpha Investments, and this provides sustainable strategies to accredited investors for public equities, as I understand it. And he spent some 19 of his 30 plus years of professional life working at Capital Research, where he was lead manager in several of the largest global equity funds. So looking forward to hearing from you, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with the group. I will say, sort of like Brian, I'll do my disclaimers up front. The SEC would want us to say this is in no way a solicitation of interest in our investment strategy. And I'm glad to be here as a thought leader in the industry more than anything else. So with that, our firm was founded in 2014 with an investment strategy and process designed to allocate our investors' capital into companies that are profitably leading the transition to a truly sustainable economy. We define a truly sustainable economy as one that serves the real needs of society and operates within the regenerative boundaries of our planet's natural systems. Water, in the form of surface and subsurface fresh water, our oceans and our glaciers, is the most important of our planet's natural systems, given its essential value to all species and virtually all aspects of our economy. Our freshwater systems are obviously have intersectional implications for other natural systems, including soils, forests, and biodiversity. Additionally, climate change is clearly acting as a threat multiplier, accelerating those already daunting pressures on our global freshwater resources and on the health of our oceans. As a long-term active investor in public equities, we seek to incorporate information and data about corporate uses of and impacts on our planet's increasingly scarce natural resources via our own environmental productivity analytical process. This helps us gauge the risks and opportunities a company may have in the years and decades ahead. The three primary environmental factors that we assess are carbon, waste streams, and water, partially because those are the most important, but also partially because that's where the most information and data is available. To us, as investors in large multinational corporations, we primarily see the risk from lack of water availability due to dwindling water supply and competition for water amongst users. We also see growing risks from liability from wider impacts from water discharge from facilities or in operations. Think Flint, Michigan. In all cases, improvement in water corporate practices around water create opportunities for the leaders across industries. Now, it's widely understood that the sectors with the largest exposure to dwindling freshwater availability are in the food and agricultural sectors, given their centrality of water to the farming, production, and processing stages. But water impacts will be felt much wider. And as a series analysis, they found that at least 50% of the stocks listed in each of the four major stock exchanges are in industries with a medium to high level of water risk. This means that all investors must develop the ability to assess the impacts of our growing global water crisis. Our own research finds that water risks in almost every company operating across almost all sectors when considering direct and indirect exposures. Think scope 1, 2, and 3 for water, with varying abilities to mitigate those risks. For example, consider the growing semiconductor industry We have seen how disruptive the current COVID-related supply shortages have proven in a time of secular demand growth. And it won't surprise most of you that semiconductor fabrication is highly energy consumptive. It is also extremely water intensive due to the need for highly purified water in fabrication. Newer processes demand even more energy and more water per wafer. Yet much of the most advanced chip production is located in water-constrained regions that are highly vulnerable to climate change-driven changes to weather patterns. From our perspective, the root cause of the growing freshwater supply crisis is a failure to properly price the real value of water, especially for the largest users of water. This can be exacerbated by local government officials who want to attract new developments in their community. As a recent example, Arizona luring new semiconductor production into water-scarce regions. In our assessment of and engagement with corporations around water risk, we demand more complete water reporting around withdrawals, processed, and net consumed water reported to organizations like Carbon Disclosure Project, otherwise known as CDP. Of course, ideal measures vary across sectors and businesses. Of even more value to us is for companies to undertake a global water risk assessment for their own and their supply chains using one of the many well-designed tools such as WRI's Aqueduct. Post the assessment, we expect corporates to publicly disclose areas of key risks and mitigation strategies. Recently, our firm agreed to join the Serious Value in Water Finance Initiative as a member of the Investor Working Group. We see this initiative as a logical parallel to the great work that's been done around greenhouse gas emissions, the science-based targets, and the Net Zero Asset Managers and Asset Owners initiative, of which we are a signatory. We need a more thorough scientific assessment of water as it relates to all sectors of our economy and the companies that operate within it. These companies in turn need better guidance on how to develop meaningful targets and strategies for managing their own water usage and impacts so that we can evolve to a regenerative demand at local and global levels. The Value in Water initiative is immediately focused on the financial materiality of water risks to two of the highest water intensive sectors, packaged foods and meats and apparel. We certainly look forward to the release of these briefs near the end of the year. I'll end by noting that the analysis of corporate water usage and impacts need considerable improvement. But most importantly, policymakers must develop water pricing strategies for all users that properly reflect the locality's water circumstances. This will also allow corporates to better develop long-term sustainable water management plans. I'll end there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. That was great. Really interesting points around the way in which we have sort of perverse incentives for some regions to attract the wrong sort of industry just for economic development reasons, and how these risks are not being priced properly. So really great insights there, and sort of fantastic to hear the energy and dynamism actually amongst many of the financial community in bringing these issues to the fore and developing tools to address them. So now I want to try and bring in people from the audience, and I see Kathleen has just sent out a chat as well simultaneously with that, so that's great, saying please do ask questions. I'm going to get some help from the team in moderating some of these, but I know there was one from Paul Arnoldus earlier on, and Paul, if you want to ask your question in person, I mean, feel free to take the floor, just unmute yourself. If not, I can read it out.
Thank you very much, Simon. This is a very interesting discussion. My question was a bit rhetorical. If we assess the risk per bank through this kind of stress test, then to what extent, according to the bank supervisors, do we capture the overall systemic risk of climate change? Because everyone takes his own particular initiative. So how do they take the knock-on effects into account? And how should the central bank respond to that? That was my question. Thank you, Sam.
No, it's just a very good question, and one that plagues the Paris Agreement in a sense, in that you've got a global goal and you're expecting national contributions to add up to that goal. So I don't know if any of our panel want to address that. I mean, Frank, I don't know if you wanted to say anything in response to that. I think you're still there.
Sure. No, I'm still here, and I'm listening very intently and learning a lot. I don't know whether I will do justice to depth of the question by saying the following, but I think we are in the process of trying to make sure as soon as we can that banks that we supervise manage all their material risks. Now, this has been something that we've done for many decades. We now understand that climate-related risks, biodiversity loss related risks, SDG related risks more generally, if you like, are a source of financial risk that must be managed by banks. Now, and of course, we know the transition channels. If you think about the fact that governments have signed up to the Paris Agreement, that the Paris Agreement is legally binding, that although we can all have our own ideas whether, you know, in the end, governments will be able to live up to these legal requirements, it is a logical thing to do to have as a kind of like a default path that indeed the world will transition according to that agreement to a net zero economy. So I think increasingly we will be asking the financial institution that we supervise to come up with clear plans as to how they will do that transition. And so I think we need to go from being happy that, you know, steps are being taken to supervising that sufficient steps are being taken to manage these risks. And in the end, it is very difficult for me to envisage a financial institution, a bank, being able to manage their climate-related risks, you know, structurally, if they don't have a clear plan how they are going to align themselves in the long run with these, you know, with that transition path. And that means that, you know, there should be rigor in terms of intermediate goals, KPIs, control functions, external disclosure, you name it, to get there. This is serious. I think you said it very well, Simon. The doctor has diagnosed us with quite a disease, hasn't it? So we better take it very seriously.
Would any of the other speakers like to comment on that? Or if not, we've got another question which I think we will all be asked to opine on. I'll perhaps move on to that. So Alex Morant asks, I'd be interested to hear the different panelists' perspectives related to the time horizons they're considering in their analysis. And then he's got some other bits to it which we can follow up later, but I'll mention them now if you can keep them in mind. Considering the rising uncertainty and risk over the longer term, what's the time horizon that you're looking at your institution? You know, is it different from the private sector? Or is that actually not true any longer and people are taking a much more informed view of risks? I think that would be a really interesting set of issues to explore. So who would like to go first?
Simon, I've got a couple of thoughts because I can give you, we have sort of two time horizons. When we think about these issues, we think about one, just the brute force realities of what's happening on our planet and the natural resource systems and that where they're going and therefore where we need to go as an economy, as a society, and if we're going to live within those. And obviously we're not living within them now. But then when we do analysis of companies, we think out 5 to 10 years, which is exceptionally long in the investment community, as you many of your audience might well know. So when we think about our analysis and investment time period, it is a 5 to 10 year time horizon. Unfortunately, that is not the norm. And even if people think longer term, they tend to have an investment time horizon that's much shorter. And that is a huge challenge as we try to address these issues today.
I think we like to say that our time horizon is really as far as visibility permits. And as you said, Simon, as far as anything related to climate change, there is one element of very clear visibility. It is happening. It is only going one way. So we know the direction. Yes, we don't know where it will manifest and how exactly intensively, and we don't know many things around tipping points and all of that, but we know the direction. So we factor that in where we think that clear direction poses risks, but what long time horizons give to issuers, which is what we're looking at as a rating agency, is time to adjust. And that we need to take into account because in the face of, in a different example, in the face of carbon transition, for instance, a coal company doesn't have much time to adjust, and that we reflect in our ratings. An auto supplier, auto manufacturer has more time to adjust. They are renovating their fleet, and they are moving towards a world that is compatible with net zero. So we need to factor that in, that time is on our, can be on our side if it is well spent. I think there is one area where I do wish we had more technical help, is in these effects of climate change that are really very slow in coming. And take the example of rising sea levels. I think we can be sometimes misled by averages. I think it doesn't help anybody to convey that sea level rise will rise by 1 meter by 2100. That's too far, that's too little too far. What we need to be able to comprehend is, well, it is 1 meter on average for the world in 2100. It will be a lot more, a lot earlier for some locations. So if we can get more of that, I think that will be tremendously useful, and I haven't yet found really the research in that area that help us understand the much more tangible, much closer, and much more meaningful implications of some of these very long-term developments.
Great. Those are really two very thoughtful interventions. Brian,
that's a great point. You know, luckily for the world that I play in, we do our budgeting for loan programs on a present value basis. And so we're sometimes asked to look forward 30, 40 years in projecting cash flows and discounting them back to the present. So our time horizon can capture those long-term effects. I think the real challenge is getting that granular level analysis and actually being able to predict that far out into the future with certainty, and explaining to our policymakers, again, what that, you know, uncertainty level is around our projections. But as Marie points out, getting away from averages and getting to asset-specific determinations is a whole different story. And because our portfolio is so broad and diverse, different tools will be needed for different asset classes.
Great. I don't know, Frank, if you wanted to say something about the ECB timescale. I think that if you're very...
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very, very important question. And of course, we all, at least, you know, when I hear this question about time horizon, I have to think of the tragedy of the horizon speech of Mark Carney, of course. And well, you know, in the stress test, we do look, you know, way beyond. So I think 30 years even we do. And so that's one thing. And, you know, to just make it maybe very tangible, you know, when a bank gives a 30 years mortgage, you know, it's relevant where that house is located, isn't it? If there's flood risk or not, if this is being used as collateral, whether this house is energy efficient or not, in terms of transition risk and government regulation. So I think it is it's obvious that that we need to start thinking more long term where that isn't being done yet.
So I think Derek Vollmer was asking a question. Derek, if you want to take the floor, I'll read it out. It's up to you. Okay, perhaps I'll read it out then. There's been a trend of businesses announcing targets and plans to offset their water use in water-stressed regions. What are the panelists' perspectives on this approach vis-a-vis risk mitigation? And of course, this is something that we see in other areas as well as water, carbon, biodiversity also. So any thoughts on that from the different speakers?
Well, I'll jump in just because we've spent a lot of time with companies and targets, particularly around, mostly around carbon, of course, these days. But there have been many who have set water goals or plans or targets. And I think we approached it the same way we would approach greenhouse gas emissions, which is we already are doing too much. We're emitting too much and we're using too much water. And so kind of a little bit of a chessboard, moving the water, usage around doesn't necessarily always work in all places. And for those localities where they need water, it doesn't really help if someone's going to create more water somewhere else. So we look for companies to be moving towards really basin level mitigation strategies and reduction strategies, and changing how their manufacturing processes work so that they use less water and impact water less. But I think that's to be determined. That is very much in the future. That's very few companies are even thinking that way at this point. So there's a lot of progress to be made, and the targets are, you have to accept them for what they are. It's better to have developed a target than to be ignoring the issue, but it's not enough, obviously.
Similar, I think we tend to see offsets as well. They do buy some time. They're not going to be the solution, either carbon on water, because we know from the science that there needs to be a gross reduction as well as a net one. But they can give some time. They can give some time to a corporate to retool, change their business model to adjust to an operating model that is less reliant on water. I think it's something that Tim said earlier as well that has really struck me in the work on this, is that the water endowment in the world varies enormously. The water is in North America, more or less, and it's not in Asia, and it's not even in Europe. And Europe is importing water-intensive goods. Asia, less so far, but as consumption patterns change, as diets change and so on, it may move in that direction. And I think that raises a question about really where different production should be located. It's doubtful as to whether North America will be able to supply the world with all the water-intensive goods.
Okay. If nobody else wants to jump in there, there's certainly more messages, and I can't keep up with them in the chat. They're flooding in now, but I think one from Nathaniel Mason is from Marie, actually. So while you're there, keep the mic. Are you seeing any evidence of improved sovereign or sub-sovereign climate and water risk assessments deterring investors away from countries with higher levels of risk or lower ability to mitigate these hazards, particularly thinking about poorer countries, the impacts of climate risk, amplifying the difficulties they face and increasing their cost of capital?
To some extent, yes. I think the risks are priced in. The water management risk, I think the risk related to water scarcity and poor natural endowment and poor water management, leakage, pollution, and so on, are priced in because we've been there for a long time. So when we look at the countries that are most exposed there, we find countries in Asia, in Middle East, North Africa, and that I think is something that investors have implicitly priced in, because we've seen the impact of that on economic activity, the constraints that poses on development. What is less really clearly priced in are what I was mentioning earlier. I think the other part that is priced in is probably the risk of some natural disaster happening at some point in some places in the world, including in particular Caribbean or the Pacific. What is, I think, less clearly priced in is the implications of these natural disasters happening more frequently, more intensively, because I think we have got used to economies bouncing back, communities bouncing back, and that's cannot be taken for granted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It may not be the same in the future. Basically, there is no new normal yet. We're still on that ramp up, and it's still changing. Yeah. So. Any other people to jump in from the panel at this point? Anything that you've heard that you want to pick up? There's a lot of interest in the effect of these risks on whether investments are made or not. Do people have any examples of investments being made or not? Yeah,
I saw that, and two examples where that's been very relevant to our investment decision-making process. One, we're generally investing in multinationals that have a variety of different businesses, but where we have seen a company that has high level of dependency on the basically of selling bottled water, extracting it from one community and shipping it in plastic bottle to another community, we've chosen not to invest in those. We just don't see that as a sustainable business model. On the other hand, we had invested in and then divested from a large commercial real estate company because they were not willing to be transparent enough about the exact locations of their owned buildings, and that to us represented a risk that we didn't know exactly what their exposures were to long-term effects of sea level rise.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting. There's more. Sorry, did you want to come in, Marie?
If I want to add some examples at the government level, including local government, it's interesting. For instance, both mayors in New York and Boston have come up with some plans to invest. Climate-proof New York, I think, is or Lower Manhattan in particular, is the term, and in Boston similarly, a plan to invest in protection against rising sea levels. So there are investments coming in. I think we probably want more of these examples to be able to assess the effectiveness of them.
Okay, great. So Frank, you're reaching for the mic, is that right?
You're very perspective. Well, the thing is that I don't know whether this is my role here because you're the moderator, but you as a moderator mentioned something that maybe is interesting for me also to hear these perspectives of some of the other panelists on, and that was legal risk. You mentioned that, increasingly we have to also think about liability risk. I have to also think that. I know that some institutions, for example, Columbia Law School, I know they are tracking all the the climate-related law litigation that's going on. I think this might become bigger. I had to think about it also when earlier in this discussion we were talking about firms and maybe also banks, of course, among them, publishing their targets and then maybe not living up to what they have promised to markets. So I was just wondering, maybe Tim or Marie, is this something that you are taking on board already? Are you seeing this? Is this increasing? Is this how big is this?
Marie, why don't you go first? I keep jumping in first, so please go ahead.
I'm happy to start, yes. It is a transmission of risk for us. It's something that we look at. So the way we ask ourselves the question is essentially we look at the strength of we assess the strength of governance of the corporate, or maybe governments have been subject to legal action as well. The strength of governance as an indicator likelihood of preventing legal action, in that it is not going to be any legal action needed or warranted because the water management, for instance, will be very strong. Or the strength of governance as after the event, should there be legal action, then the capacity of the entity to respond to that effectively. It is something that at this stage we're factoring in as an event risk. So it's not something that we're taking into account and say reducing ratings across the board because of that eventuality, because it is likely, while it may become more frequent and pervasive, it is likely that still not everyone will be facing the same legal risk. And as I said, governance is likely to be a differentiating factor there in capacity to respond to that.
Yeah, and I'll have a quick answer, and I'd be curious to hear Brian's response, because I think it's self-evident as freshwater supplies dwindle while demand is growing, that we're going to have stresses around who's responsible for controlling the water, who's impacted the water negatively in all sorts of ways, and that could be everything from pollutants in the water, at a systemic level around plastics or pharmaceuticals and other things, to who took too much water and whose water really it is. So I think there's going to be massive issues with that. And in the United States, we have this quirky situation where the federal government doesn't even have any control over this, and it's really at a state level largely. And that creates its own issues, as we've seen recently. We don't always agree with each other at the state level. So I'd be really curious to see how the new policies that the federal government's putting in place, and Brian's perspective on it might be quite interesting.
Thanks, Tim. So I'll say, at the very least, we're always looking to our private sector counterparties, our ratings agency counterparties, and learning about the new best practices, right? So this is something that maybe hasn't been incorporated in the past, but if it's becoming a clear emerging risk, it's something that we need to look at with our programs, especially when you're looking at our big infrastructure project finance programs. We're always looking at supplier risk, we're looking at off-taker risk, legal and governance. And so if this is an area that is emerging and we need to go back to our respective agencies and say, listen, do this analysis, tell me if this is a relevant risk to this project, then I think that's something that we need to get working on now, if it's not if, but given its emergence as a new risk.
Sure.
Or as a newly recognized risk, I should say.
Thanks very much. We're really up against the clock now, and that's been such a fascinating discussion. I'm going to give everybody just 1 minute to just say a takeaway from maybe reflecting on what somebody else has said on the panel, or a question, and just mention there's a couple of questions I didn't get to. Well, there's a lot of questions I didn't get to in the chat, but there's two. What are the 2 or 3 key interventions that should be prioritized in this area, and how do you actually determine the price of water as another? So easy questions to finish with, if you want to go for that, or you can just carry on and give some reactions of your own personally. And I apologize to all those who have put questions in the chat and I didn't get to them early enough, but it's been such a fascinating discussion. We'll save the questions, and no doubt we'll come back to them in future iterations of the roundtable as well. But please, just 1 minute. Brian, while you're on the screen, as it were, why don't you say if there's anything that you'd like to say at this point?
Absolutely, and such an easy question to end on. I'll say that we're in the early innings of thinking through these challenges at the federal level. The executive order was issued a few months ago, and so before we can get to specific interventions, we have a lot of work we still need to do in analyzing, identifying, quantifying. And luckily, we're not starting from scratch. We have a great deal of examples to look to and to iterate upon. And so while that's not, again, a satisfying answer, I think that you're seeing a huge deal of management attention from our policy officials on these issues. And they have been extremely clear with us that, this is going to be an integral part of our analysis moving forward. So, if you ask me in 6 months or a year from now the same question, I'll probably have a very different response for you.
Great. Well, we may well just do that. And thank you very much for your participation today. That's been great. Thank you. So, Tim, you mentioned pricing. So I'm going to come to you next.
Well, I was going to say that. Exactly. So I think absent a real price on water, the entities that are using the most water, the private sector, are not going to change practices. And we absolutely have to reduce the amount of water we're using across all economic sectors in order to be operating at a regenerative level.
Great. And anything else you'd like to say? You've got
I think part of this
30
is,
seconds at least.
Okay. Part of it, we're in a situation, think where we are at net zero and greenhouse gas emissions. We have a strategy, we have an approach, we're developing a plan. And the corporate world, we're nowhere close to that on water. And I think a lot of the attention has been on water risk from a sea level rise and climate related risk, but the real risk is inland, where we're not going to have enough water to actually operate our society.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. And again, thank you for wonderful contributions today. Marie, come to you.
Bouncing off what Tim just said, I do take comfort from the very significant acceleration momentum around greening the economy. And I agree, water is not yet really quite on par with the sort of carbon type of discussions. But I take comfort from the fact that really the discussions have accelerated on carbon, and so they can accelerate on water too. I also take comfort from the fact that there is, I think, a lot of experience in dealing with long-term, slow-burning questions. When we think about education, healthcare policy, urban planning, all of that has long been done for the long term. So there's really experience and thinking that we can tap there. I think if we can move the discussion forward by going from averages to distribution of impact, if we can move the discussion forward with some specific actions, pricing, taxation, investment. None of that is new in a way. So there's a lot that the world knows around all this. Hopefully, I'm hopeful that there will be progress made.
Thank you so much, Marie. And contrary to the name of your firm, you were very optimistic, I thought there. Not at all moody. But no, that's been a tremendous contribution, and thank you so much for being with us today and taking part so energetically and informatively. That's really wonderful remarks. So Frank, just any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with? That would be.
Thank you very much, Simon. You put the bar very high. I think to a certain extent, it has been said that we can learn from how the world has dealt with climate, and it's almost blasphemy that I say this, because we are 3-4 decades too late on climate, but we can still learn. And I think there's a number of ingredients there that we have identified here today that we can also use on the waterfront, if you like. And that is that it helps tremendously if there is a world strategy, and if it's legally binding, if there's a treaty and governments have signed up to that. So that is one thing. Then I think it is super helpful that there is pricing. I think Tim made it very clearly on CO2, and that of course can be applied in other areas of the economy. Then I think it is super important that everyone plays his and her role. So if you bring it into the financial sphere, the credit rating agencies, the investors, the banks, but also the supervisors and the central banks, we all have to play that role. And when that whole machine, if you like, is all directed in line with that worldwide strategy, then you get somewhere. And I think that, and I will end here, but supervisors have a key role to play in terms of the leverage that we have. Of course, we have leverage on the financial sector. The financial sector has leverage on its clients, and its clients is the real economy. So that process, if that can be aligned with the worldwide strategy, then things are moving, and the millions, the billions, and the trillions will move in the right direction.
Fantastic. What a way to end. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining us today. That was great. Thank you to all our panelists. And I'm not going to give any summary remarks. I'm just going to pass straight away to Kathleen. And just final thank you. And so appreciated that you took part today. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Simon. What a fascinating discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and to me, that seems like a topic that we'll want to revisit in future roundtable meetings, as you mentioned, as this moves forward and advances. We are going to pause now for a short break. We are going to pause for 15 minutes, so I just encourage you to take a break from the screen, make a cup of tea or coffee. But please come back and join us at 15 past the hour. We have the final session of the roundtable looking at women's empowerment and environmental justice. We have an excellent panel, so please come back for that, and closing remarks from the World Bank as well. So yeah, thank you all for your attention and participation, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started with the final session here. Very interesting discussion lined up to really look at the interconnections between investments in climate resilient water security and how those contribute to broader policy objectives, including women's empowerment and environmental justice. This is a hugely important topic, and we have a very good panel lined up. I'd like to introduce our chair for this session, Vedika Bandakar, who is now the Chief Operating Officer at Water.org. She previously served as Water.org's Chief Global Impact Officer and the Managing Director in India, prior to joining Water.org in January 2016. She served as the vice chairman and managing director at Credit Suisse Securities in India from 2010 to 2015, and also served as a managing director and head of investment banking at JP Morgan. So great to have someone of her depth of experience bringing her financial savvy to crack the issues of getting water to those who need it most, water and sanitation. Vedika, without any further ado, please over to you to get started in the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Kathleen, and for inviting me to this panel. And thank you all for attending this important and final session of the Roundtable on Financing Water. Water.org has participated in several of these roundtables, and it's exciting to observe how each roundtable gets more sophisticated, gets more comprehensive, both in exploration of the challenges, as well as discussing the solutions. It's also gratifying to see the participation grow, not just in terms of number of participants, but all the variety of participants, right? We had the central bank in the earlier session, we have investors, corporates, water sector players, of course, and the breadth of expertise which is brought to this literal, or in this case, the virtual roundtable. It's fitting that the last topic selected for a deep dive on how climate resilient investments in water security contribute to women empowerment and environment justice. We know that women are the backbone, and more often than not are the change agents for both households as well as communities. And investments that are made by governments, that are made by donors, that are made by financial institutions, by investors, corporates, inevitably depend upon these households and communities for success. So rather than viewing this conversation as a specific conversation about women's economic empowerment, I urge all of us to see women as the means or the vehicle through which most of our finance-oriented solutions for climate resilient water security will flow, and upon which the success depends. Now, as many of you may know, Water.org is focused on reducing or removing financial barriers that stand between those living at the base of the economic pyramid and access to safe water or sanitation. Now, much of our work includes partnering with financial institutions. So all sorts of financial institutions, from microfinance institutions to large commercial banks, private sector banks, government-owned banks, cooperatives, self-help group institutions, and partnering with them so that they are able to originate assets, they're able to make dedicated loans to households that need access to either water to connect to water services or need access to sanitation. An increasing component of our work and of our portfolio, which I'm sure you'll hear about more over the years, is working with water and sanitation service providers, including utilities, and helping build the creditworthiness of these service providers and utilities so that they can attract additional sources of capital, so that they can connect, expand, and improve their services to the lower income communities. And finally, as we all know, you cannot fully sustainably reduce the financial barriers or remove the financial barriers without really thinking about at the institutional or the governance level. So our work also increasingly looks at policy and regulatory shifts that are needed to ensure an enabling environment in which these financial institutions, as well as service providers, utilities, are encouraged for the long term. Now, top-down solutions are, of course, needed, but they also need to be complemented by solutions rising from the ground up. So I would like to give you a small, quick example of a ground-up solution. So in India, in the state of Odisha, in the eastern part of India, small communities of women, groups of women, in one group 5, in another group 7, in another group 10 women, they've started coming together and taking group loans from a micro lender to construct community bore wells in their respective neighborhoods. Now, these wells run deep, which is needed, unfortunately, in an area where the water table has been depleted. But a single large community bore well, which serves multiple families, is a much more climate resilient solution than a series of smaller but equally deep household bore wells. And so these group of women get together, they monitor, they self-police the consumption, they take care of the operations and maintenance. In fact, they contribute to O&M on a monthly level. It didn't happen in the first one, but after that, these community bore wells have also started including an element of collecting the rainwater and helping recharge of the groundwater, so that we end up with a much more climate resilient solution, which is also much more cost effective than a single household digging its own bore well. So in this example, the women knew what they wanted to do. They didn't need to wait for a donor. They didn't need to wait for a government to come in and do it for them. What they did need was access to upfront capital so that they could act. So I'm really pleased to be chairing this conversation today. We have a great panel of speakers, and where I do hope we can explore additional areas where loan financing, guarantees, and other such financial tools can play a fundamental role in promoting climate resilient water security, where women are, and not just women, all other actors who are typically left behind are actually in the driver's seat. So with that, it's my real pleasure to invite our first panelist, Ms. Radhika Fox. Radhika is the Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Environment Protection Agency's Office of Water. The Office of Water works to ensure that drinking water is safe, wastewater is safely returned to the environment, and surface waters are properly managed and protected. Prior to joining EPA, Radhika served as Chief Executive for the U.S. Water Alliance, Director for Policy and Government Affairs for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and the Federal Policy Director at PolicyLink. She brings more than 20 years of her experience addressing the most salient issues, water issues facing the United States. And Radhika, it would be great to hear from you about the US EPA's approach to financing climate resilient water security in a way that contributes to environmental justice and women's empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, and such an honor to join this really important discussion. I want to thank you for that introduction, Radhika, and I also want to thank OECD for hosting this session. It's just really an honor to be part of a panel with such incredible women who are leaders in water. And I have to say that, given that our conversation today is about women's empowerment, I have to say, I feel very privileged to be the first woman of color, Senate confirmed, to lead the Office of Water at the Environmental Protection Agency. And I think me sitting in this seat is really, I think, an example of President Biden's commitment to build the most diverse administration that we have seen, and he is following through on that. Not only at the Environmental Protection Agency, but really across the federal government. Before to sort of get us into this conversation, I wanted to actually start with a personal story about my connection to water. From a very early age, I developed a deep appreciation for the role that water infrastructure can play in uplifting communities. As a child, I spent a lot of time with my family in rural India. My grandmother lived in a village that lacked basic water infrastructure. And there we drew drinking water from a well, and we relied on pit latrines to take care of our wastewater. And as many probably know, this is actually a very relatively lucky situation when it comes to water security in India decades ago. At the same time, living in America, we had safe, reliable water without thinking about it. We turned on the tap and clean water flowed out. We flushed the toilet, and that dirty water went away and was cleaned and safely returned to the environment. And so I think my point is that, even as a child, I could clearly see that connection between water infrastructure and water resources and opportunity. So, on today's theme, women are, as you all know, at the intersection of so many who are being left behind all across the globe. Women make up the majority of the world's poor. They are more likely to reside in environmental justice communities, without consistent access to water quality service. And all of this, of course, is exacerbated by the climate crisis. When weather events displace people, it's women and girls who suffer increased gender-based violence. And when water shortages place water resources further and further away from community centers, it's women and girls who bear the brunt of the work to secure water for their families. And it's often, at their own personal risk. And I think that you all at water.org have been doing such an excellent job really making sure the world knows about these challenges and also the leadership of women. Because we do know that women continue to be water stewards. They are frequently in charge of collecting water for their families and undertaking tasks that require clean water, like managing water resources for farming. And so this really tells us that it's women and girls around the world are uniquely positioned to understand the challenges on water resources and to develop innovative and locally relevant solutions. Water issues are women's issues. And when we think about the future of water investment and water policy, we need women at the table leading these conversations. Let me now talk a little bit about how President Biden is thinking about both empowering equity and water infrastructure financing. So, President Biden has called for his administration to embed equity into everything that we do. And for me and for the Office of Water at EPA, equity means really three things. First, everyone has to have access to clean, safe water. And for women, the global community should also consider how we make collection of water safe. Second, investments in water infrastructure must be equitably spread. In the US, we think of this in the context of environmental justice communities. And we really ask ourselves, are the places, the communities with the most urgent need for investment getting that investment? And finally, we have to center decisions that we make at the Environmental Protection Agency in the lived experience and wisdom of the communities that we serve. And this is very new for the EPA. We are good at writing our regulations and sitting behind desks in Washington, D.C. It's a much different thing for us to center our decision-making on the lived experience of the communities that we are charged with serving. And I think this is such a critical piece because while women across the world are water stewards, they're not often elevated as water leaders or water managers in many of these organizations and institutions. So for us, again, sustainable water policy needs to elevate women as leaders and provide women and girls with the resources to develop community-based solutions. As far as financing and financing equity, President Biden, I think, has put forward the most ambitious ideas around this that we have ever seen in the United States. President Biden has called for what we're calling Justice 40, an initiative where he wants to see 40% of investments that we make as a federal government go to disadvantaged communities. And of course, we have a whole range of loan and grant programs at the EPA that we are really thinking about. How do we direct 40%? How do we deliver on this Justice 40 commitment? Two big ways, a couple of ways that we're trying to do that is one, our clean water state revolving. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt, Radhika. Would you mind wrapping it up maybe in another 30 seconds?
Sure. Well, I can just wait for the discussion. I was going to talk about some of our funding and finance. No, that's fine. Go ahead.
No, please finish your thought. Yeah.
Sure. So, what I was saying is that I think one of the big grand, aspirations that we have at the EPA is how we really apply this Justice 40 pilot program to our funding and financing programs, which again, I can talk about as we get into the discussion.
Thank you. And it was really, thank you, Radhika. And sorry to cut you off. Kathleen keeps all of us very much on time. So, but it was really interesting to hear about the equity and the 3 dimensions of equity in terms of access, investment, and keeping the communities at the center, as well as the Justice 40 program and the pilot. So thank you for that. I would now love to invite Yosine Sloots to talk about Aqua for All's work in the context of climate and gender. Yosine is the managing director for Aqua for All, a nonprofit organization established in 2002 by the Dutch water sector. She's also a member of the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council's advisory group. And prior to her current position, she was director of NPM, Platform for Inclusive Finance. And before that, held a senior position at Rabo Development. And she's also worked for the World Food Program in India. Over to you, Yosine.
Thank you so much, Vedika, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you, Kathleen, also for the invitation and the prep work that we did together. It's really an honor to be presenting here today. Well, beyond not having access to water and sanitation solutions, as Henk Ovink already pointed out, I think that access to water and sanitation, without access to water and sanitation services for women, the effect is even bigger. And that is something that we want to emphasize during this session. It's bad enough as it is, the figures are huge and we need to be catalytic. But we want to emphasize that whatever we do, we need to do that with a climate angle and with a gender lens. And I think we need to continue to emphasize that. So, you know, when I started with Aqua for All almost 2 years ago, I of course had a look at, you know, where does the sector stand and what is our responsibility. It is indeed extremely important to bridge not only the service gap, that's what we do through working with entrepreneurs, but also find smart solutions to make sure that we bridge that financing gap. It is huge, so we need to work hard and we need to be smart about what we do. And this is also, you know, the reason why we chose not only to work with the entrepreneurs on the one hand side, but also to work with impact investors and financial institutions on the other side. Vedika already gave the introduction of very high of what water.org does. And of course, when I first heard about it, it was so obvious for me that, that we need to support the initiatives of her organization. And especially, of course, I know coming from the financial inclusion world, that women are borrowers very frequently when you look at microfinance, etc. So again, back to gender and climate, and then of course, financing for WASH. It has been mentioned before this afternoon, we need to quantify what we're talking about, because only then we can steer towards the right solutions in the sector. And so if we have an understanding of what effect it has on women, we can also try to mitigate them. If we look at, you know, Aqua for All works with private sector, we hardly, well, for a small part, when we look at financing, we look at utilities, but not majorly. If we do work with utilities, it's the smaller ones. We work with organizations that offer mini-grid or off-grid solutions, etc. So by working closely with impact investors or investment advisors even, we as a not-for-profit grant provider understand much better how we need to allocate our grant funding. Because I've seen it in many different sectors, in agriculture, in maybe even a little bit less in renewable energy, but also when you look at, you know, refugees, how they are approached and incorporated to be inclusive in the society. What NGOs and foundations do quite often doesn't match with the needs of the investors. So in order for us to make sure that, you know, we offer solutions in the right way and we facilitate entrepreneurs to become investment ready, as from the perspective of the investors, we need to understand what is needed. And that is our focus. So on the one hand, directly with entrepreneurs, on the other hand, with impact investors. And so I'll give you a few examples in that field. So I already mentioned the work with water.org, their guarantee scheme, and a lot of direct interference with the financial institutions. We also work with impact investors that provide liquidity to financial institutions that then on lend to households. Big effect on gender, for sure, but also on lend to enterprises. So how do we then promote this water and sanitation sector amongst impact investors? Because when I was working on that side, there was a very limited understanding. And so we need to get them along. We need to start motivating and incentivizing them. So one of the things is a collaboration with one of the big Dutch impact investors, Actian, who's going to set up a 250 million euro fund series for water and sanitation. They target financial institutions in a number of countries, and we provide those financial institutions with a discount, a 1% discount on an annual basis in order for them to embrace water and sanitation as part of their portfolio. There are also other impact investors that say, like, look, you know, we now, after 2 years of working with them, we understand that it's a very important asset class, mostly with a huge amount of impact when you look at climate and gender. So I'm going to round off Vedika. And so what we do is say, like, if you are going to provide liquidity to those institutions, we will be supporting those institutions with technical assistance according to what you see that their needs are. So I think during the discussions, I will talk a little bit more about the incentives that we also provide on the level of enterprises that indeed do have a climate and gender effect. I'll give the floor back to you, Vedika.
Thank you so much, Yosine. I think, you know, some of the concepts which you talked about, catalytic funding, and thinking about how can grants be allocated more efficiently so that you are crowding in more private investors, facilitating entrepreneurs to get investment ready, helping FIs, which in turn lend to households and enterprises. All of that is really makes a lot of sense. I would now like to turn to our third panelist, Zoni Woods. Zoni is a senior social development specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Prior to this position, she worked as a gender and social development specialist at the ADB from between January 2016 to November 2020. She's an experienced professional with a demonstrated history of working on gender and climate change. And she worked as a consultant on these topics, including sustainable development for 10 years prior to joining the ADB. Zoni, it would be great to hear from you on you know, how ADB's work, give us some insights about ADB's work at the intersection of water security, climate action, and women's empowerment. Over to you.
Thank you, Vedika, and thank you for the opportunity to provide some insights on our work at ADB at the intersection of water security, climate action, and women's empowerment. So yes, by way of background, my work at ADB focuses mostly on the intersection between gender and climate change overall across a number of different sectors and departments. So at the outset, I would like to start by reflecting that given that this work is so profoundly cross-sectoral, the way that the OECD has framed this discussion is, I think, very valuable because it gives us an opportunity to look at what issues are critical for a coherent approach to water that will ultimately result in environmental justice and gender equality. So in fact, it is very much in line with some of the issues raised by the Global Commission on Adaptation, which recognize that water-related action makes adaptation to address diverse vulnerabilities across sectors and groups more effective. So just to give you some background, ADB has twin gender equality and climate change targets at the highest level of commitment in our organization. So 75% of our operations by number must be gender mainstreamed, and 55% in our 2 highest gender categories. And I will speak about that a little bit later. And also for climate change, 75% of our projects must be mitigation or adaptation by number as well by 2030. So by 2030, at least half of our projects must be climate and gender. And so in a way, this makes us both a gender and a climate bank. So climate investments include targets and designs to address gender issues and promote gender equality through that may be gender transformative. So for example, projects that support women's voice and agency, infrastructure and services that substantially improve the lives of women and girls, projects that support women's entrepreneurship, including women-owned and women-led enterprises. And finally, by creating an enabling environment for women's labor force participation, including workplace equity, so looking at staffing, management, boardroom representation, and also along supply chains. So I will just briefly discuss one ADB project that provides, I think, a good example of gender mainstreaming in the water sector. And that is the West Bengal Drinking Water Sector Improvement Project. Now, this project belongs to ADB's highest gender category, which is gender equity. So gender equity projects must directly address gender equality or women's empowerment by narrowing gender disparities, including reducing women's time poverty and drudgery, and strengthening women's resilience to external shocks. So West Bengal faces many challenges to its rural drinking water security. It's the 4th most populous state in India, and only about 47% of the state, the rural population, has a piped water supply. And this is compared to the national average, which is 56%. So the project has 2 overall outputs. One is climate resilient drinking water infrastructure, and the other was institutions and capacity of stakeholders for drinking water service delivery strengthened. So lessons learned from ADB projects in India and elsewhere have shown us that the inclusion of women is necessary for ensuring responsive service delivery. So this project includes women in service delivery, provides opportunities for women's leadership. It includes a target for operated services with a minimum 33% of female staff in one of the states with the lowest women's labor force participation. So the provision of continuous water, potable water through meter connections is expected to substantially reduce the drudgery of women and girls and time poverty, and free time for more productive work, including attending schools. So through the project, women will receive trade certified trainings on utility management, which will enhance their employability at the local level and also elsewhere. The Public Health Engineering Department will conduct a gender audit and develop a gender strategy. And the project will institutionalize a gender responsive policy framework for drinking water service delivery in West Bengal. So the project interventions overall will contribute to women's increased awareness as well on water conservation, demand management, and water and sanitation and hygiene. I know that I'm running out of time, I think, yes? Okay, so I'll come back to what I wanted to say next in the discussion, but I will just conclude with 3 observations. I think that 1, climate finance needs to focus on gender equality as a principal objective. So we need to be very intentional about investing in gender equality. And unfortunately, many of the projects, the climate change projects, climate resilient projects, have gender equality as a secondary objective or only look at it as a co-benefit. The second is that we need to increase support to community-led action on gender and climate change, including by supporting women's rights organizations. And this is something that Radhika talked about earlier. And then finally, I think we need to do more to improve women's opportunities to participate both in the green and the blue economy, as well as in the just transition. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, really good. And I wasn't aware of the twin objectives of ADB. So that was really good to hear about gender equality and climate change. But I particularly, I love the example of West Bengal, but also the point that which you made, which is gender equality has to be the primary objective of the climate resilient projects, and which I thought was spot on. It can't be an added on benefit, but it has to be the primary objective. So thank you for saying that. And now it's my pleasure to turn to our fourth panelist, Camila Galiza. Camila is a social development specialist with the Water Global Practice at the World Bank, where she supports deepening social inclusion in global programs and World Bank lending through operational support, capacity building, knowledge creation, and research. Camila led the preparation of the Women in Water Utilities Breaking Barriers report, and is currently the task team leader for Equal Aqua platform for promoting gender diversity and inclusion in water institutions. It would be great to hear about both of these from you, Camila, the Women in Water Utilities, as well as the Equal Aqua platform. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. So let me start by stating the obvious, I guess, that the link between water, gender, and climate is documented. And as this discussion already shows, there are many opportunities we have to address global challenges in these interconnected areas. Climate events are almost always linked to water, and water affects women differently than men. So as women and girls tend to be responsible for collecting water, for example, climate change can affect their attendance at schools, their health, safety, especially in water scarce areas. And as evidence shows, whether it's droughts or floods, there are gender differences in preparedness, in access to information, and impact, and in the response that follows. Often women are affected disproportionately, as we've heard from previous panelists, yet they tend to be missing in shaping decisions related to water. So as investments in water are required to address climate needs, it's that much more important to ensure that water institutions are diverse, so they can actually better represent the clients, the stakeholders, and the communities they serve. Water institutions now need all hands on deck, and yet women are underrepresented in decision-making spaces and in jobs. So in 2019, we published Breaking Barriers report, finding that on average, less than 1 in 5 employees in water and sanitation utility were female. Similarly, women were underrepresented among engineers and managers. And this is a missed opportunity, and that is likely to lead to less than optimal utility performance, because where women are present in decision-making, the decisions will better reflect the needs and preferences of the population they serve. And from private sector, we know that companies with gender diverse executive teams are 21% more likely to perform better on profitability, according to McKinsey. So from that analytical base, we moved to action, setting up Equal Aqua, which is supported by GWSB Trust Fund, which is a global platform for inclusive water institutions. And it brings together water organizations, associations, academia, utilities, and other international organizations, and provides for partners and institutions a framework and tools, as well as evidence and benchmarking on gender diversity in the water sector. We also have space for knowledge exchange. So we have 16 official partners and many other affiliated institutions who can use Equal Aqua's diagnostic tools to identify their strengths, areas for improvement, and can use data to drive decisions. Through the platform, we provide guidance and peer-to-peer support for water companies, and we aggregate the various tools and resources, thereby lowering barriers smaller utilities or entities may face in undertaking some of the initiatives. And our partners learn from one another, and it's a collaborative and they can also collaborate on joint activities. So, for example, with University of Technology Sydney, we are finalizing a joint database on diversity and inclusion actions, and in the coming weeks, we will be launching an online course on the topic. So far, Equal Aqua's tools and those tools to improve gender diversity have benefited our partners and also informed more than 30 World Bank projects, which is total more than 4.6 billion in World Bank financing. So let me just maybe finish by saying that, you know, we recognize that the barriers women face in water jobs are universal in male-dominated spaces in general. And these lessons are applicable not just to water and sanitation sector, but for all, you know, water sector institutions. We can start by looking who is excluded from the conversation and who's not at the table, and then we can ask why and plan to do something about it. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And I hope by, you know, you said you did the Breaking Barriers report in 2019, maybe by 2030, when you do the next version of the report, the statistics will look much better and it will not be less than 1 in 5 women. But thank you for talking about the Equal Outcome platform, because I think there is a question later where you could talk a little bit about how you know, water companies as well as small utilities could use this. But before we go into the Q&A, I did have one question. I wanted to start it off and ask Radhika if, and I know I'm sorry I cut you off, but if you would like to talk a little bit more about how the Justice 40 applies to water infrastructure financing programs.
Sure, yes. We are starting to advance President Biden's Justice 40 initiative by looking at the structural barriers that communities have faced in accessing both the drinking water and clean water SRF programs, which are the largest financing vehicle in America for drinking water, wastewater projects. And they represent about 30% of the EPA's annual budget. And so we're looking at what are the structural barriers that disadvantaged communities face in accessing those funds. And then because there are vehicles that go through state government, we are looking at what additional program authority, what legal authority do we have to try to be more directive in how those resources go. We're developing as well for the first time sort of metrics about how do we define benefit to those communities and then really partner with them to kind of get them in line for them. So, you know, if we're, I like to say to the team, you know, even if it's Justice 20 in the first year and then we move to Justice 30 and Justice 40, the fact that this is the first time as a country we're benchmarking where those investments are going and where they are going. I think we'll learn a lot and hopefully evolve it over time.
Thank you. And I think that's a good way to tell your team at 20, 30, 40, and maybe then even more, right, as time passes. I see a question in the chat box, and I would encourage Rachel, if you would like to ask the question yourself, or would you like me to read it out? Please feel free to ask the questions by demuting yourself.
Sure. Hi, and it's really early morning on the West Coast, so I'm kind of cozy in my sweater and hat. But hi, everybody. My question really is around wanting, you know, we understand that these are systemic problems, right? And so I'm just curious for the panel's ideas on or thoughts on sort of the specific things in the financial sector that, like, what are those systemic barriers? Are there specific policies or practices, or is it really just kind of patriarchy and culture that inhibits investment to women, to women-led businesses, or you know, female entrepreneurs and so forth? Like, you know, so beyond just the you know, yes, there are these really great initiatives. Are there certain policies, or I don't know, you know, things that are things that we could kind of galvanize action toward changing? So I'm just curious for the panel's thoughts on that, and thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go first? Yosi?
Well, I can give it a shot, and thank you so much, Rachel, for that question. I saw it in the chat box, so I had a little bit of time to think about it, but mostly I think that, you know, as also Camilla was saying before, you know, if you look at the performance of enterprises with women at the top, they are generally speaking, doing very well. And the same goes for if you look at lending to women, they also pay back very well. So it's mostly, I think that it's not necessarily that at the investor level that there need to be incentives. It's mostly that we can team up with investors and say, like, we take a gender perspective, because it will result in better investments in the end. And so once we start to mobilize this field of expertise, that is, of course, also quite powerful, and make sure that once they select companies and they look at the risk and they see that women are there, that they understand that the risk is a little bit less. So in that sense, I think it's very good to start promoting that. But there are also other instruments, but Vedika, maybe I'll touch upon like incentives to move towards more gender kind of investments later, and I'll stop here and give the others the opportunity.
Thank you. Camila, would you like?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And, I think there is a business case. And in fact, 2 days ago, we had a webinar organized together with our partners from Community of Women in Water and GWP. And one of the panelists was a utility manager, and she said, our business was not reaching the customers we wanted to, so we needed to mirror what our customers look like internally, so we can deliver better customer experience. These are very powerful parity, right? When it comes to solutions, I think, at least in our projects, we look very carefully at every time there's a project, we need to look at context, and these barriers will be very different depending where you work. And we work across the world. So it's important to have good assessment, to look carefully at gender norms, at laws, at barriers, at institutional situations, HR policies, if these are more internal aspects.
Camila, sorry to interrupt. I think you're fading in and out. I don't know if you want to come closer to the mic.
Female entrepreneurship, what are the barriers? When it comes to, let me turn off my camera. When it comes to the solutions, they will be context dependent. So we need to look carefully at data, at gender assessments, and understand what these barriers are, so that solutions can be matched to those. And we do that in water projects at the World Bank, in Water Global Practice. All of them look at those. They identify actions, and then have also indicators in results framework, so we can measure progress. And I hope this progress will, of course, get better.
Thank you. Zani, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, oh, sorry, I'm trying to, yes. Yeah, so I think generally Rachel is correct. I mean, some of it boils down to still, patriarchal norms and gender norms and perceptions about sort of how women can run businesses. I think there's a lot of work to be done with the banks so that they provide actually particular services for women, and that they understand the needs of their women clients, entrepreneurs. I think we've done a lot of work in trying to, for example, in countries like Cambodia, to support how women-led businesses are registered, as well as working with organizations and networks of women entrepreneurs so that they can support each other. I think that the peer support in this case is very important. So there's a number of things that are barriers, and then there are a number of ways that we've been trying to work to support women entrepreneurs. And I think that there's some innovative approaches like using psychometric assessments, for example, that have been used sort of successfully in countries like India, mostly in a lot of countries in Africa, to really demonstrate sort of that women are a good sort of business risk, and to encourage banks to lend to women. We have a lot of microcredit, but we have a lot of also women that are in the underserved sort of middle, medium enterprises that I think we need to also focus on to make sure that they can grow their businesses from small businesses to medium and other enterprises. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that there's some really important work that is being done by women's networks, Women's World Bank, banking organizations that we should be looking at also. Thank you.
Thank you. All great points, and I just wanted to also add another example from India, which is, Eugene, we're working with Finnish, but I don't know if you're aware of this. It's really to help train women masons, right? And so that they're able to build the right toilets, they're able to retrofit, they're able to build bathrooms. And interestingly, this need has come also because a lot of the men, the masons, they just move, they migrate or move to a bigger place, and hence the customers who need their services aren't able to get. So there was a real need from the consumers themselves. There was a gender imperative, and we're capitalizing or leveraging on that opportunity. So I think it's all of what you said. It's we need all of these solutions. I see another question from Catherine. Catherine, would you like to say your question out aloud, and do you want to address it to any particular person? I'm equally happy to read it if you'd like me to. Okay, I'll read it. So it would be great to hear how some of the projects mentioned track impact from their interventions. Effects of increased equality can manifest in many different ways across the economy and local context. So how's impact really measured in these contexts? I don't know who would like to go first on this one. Maybe Camilla, would you like to try?
Sure, thank you. This is a very good question, and it's actually something that we are thinking a lot about.
Camilla, your microphone's again creating problems, sorry.
Let me try. Can you hear me now better?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. So we do, when we look at impact of our interventions, we do that through impact evaluations at the World Bank. And we have some on water, and it really shows what interventions where women are more represented are more effective. You cannot hear me, okay?
Yeah, your line's bad, sorry. Maybe we come back to you.
I'll connect from my phone, so just, okay. I'll connect from your phone.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, yeah. Zani, would you like to talk a little bit about how ADB looks at impact?
Sure. So maybe I can just sort of briefly talk about sort of how we set up our projects, because I think that will give you an idea of how we look at our impact. So we start with doing gender analysis, collecting sex disaggregated data in order for us to establish our gender-related targets. And so we need to make sure that our targets are achievable and measurable, and that we have buy-in from our development partners and government partners so that because they will be the ones ultimately implementing them. We dedicate resources to working on the gender mainstreaming aspects, including the gender action plan. And we regularly, as part of the reporting on the project, they have to, it's either, usually it's a quarterly reporting on progress against those indicators. We also look at how we are doing at midterm, and then at the end of the project. we do what is called a project completion report, where we look at both quantitative and qualitative measures of impact. One of the things that I think is unique about ADB is depending on the level of gender mainstreaming. So for the highest levels of gender mainstreaming, at least 80% of the indicators in the gender action plan have to have been successfully implemented in order to consider that the project has been effective. So we do have, you know, along every step from the beginning until the end, we have these measurements. In terms of sort of long-term impact, I think it's important whenever possible to see how we can do longitudinal studies to really measure the impact. I think this is something that perhaps we're not doing enough of, but it is very useful because, you know, our projects are, you know, 5 years in length, and change takes sometimes a lot longer. And I think particularly if we're looking at issues related to water and sanitation and improvements in women's lives, and how gender norms may have changed over time, how their drudgery has been reduced and so on, I think it requires sort of a longer type of study than what we can provide through our, you know, our reporting at the end of the project. And it's really important to figure out how we can do that.
Yeah, thank you. Camilla, are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Perfect. No, thank you so much. Well, I'm glad Zoni had a chance to speak because for us it's going to be very similar. We in World Bank supported projects, we look at identification of gender gaps, we have actions and then indicators. And of course, these indicators are part of results framework, which is reviewed regularly. So this is very similar. And I think it's just good development. We have to measure our work. When it comes, but one more thing that's worth considering is that when we provide, you know, when we include actions to support women, and it's also important to consider that not all actions are created equal, and some have more evidence to support their effectiveness. And I think that's one area that we need to do more overall, and being selective and really think what brings the best results. And I fully agree with Zoni on impact evaluations. So I think that's just, you know, really following data, following evidence, and making sure our work is aligned. At the World Bank, we have gender innovation labs. We have different groups of researchers who look at these very carefully. So it is very important.
Thank you. Yazine, did you want to add?
Yes, please. So, of course, like Camilla and Zoni were pointing out, on project level, it's important that you set gender and climate indicators for whatever we do. But I also wanted to share a very practical example of how we can also steer the project or the enterprises that we work with towards more impact results. And that is a model that we developed together with another advisory firm. It's called Social Impact Incentives Model. We reached out to a number of organizations and asked them if they wanted to design this tool with us. So they are enterprises that are already quite sustainable. They must be able to attract at a minimum 500,000 in private capital. And then what we said is, if you look at you know, more impact for your organization, we are going to pay you incentives based on transformation, based on whether you access more remote areas. Of course, this has a huge gender effect. And so the very practical example is K-Wash in Cambodia. They do pipe systems, and we asked them to go to remote areas. And they would not have done those investments towards these areas if it were not through our incentive payment. So what we said is, for 3 years, we're going to pay you incentives. And we really built relays, understanding what impact that they realize, what is the payout, and so on and so on. And so the result is that in the remote areas, after 3 years, they have paying customers and they don't need our grant funding anymore. And so it also shows that, you know, in remote areas, it can be beneficial. There can be a client base that then helps to scale the business into areas that they would otherwise not have entered into. So if we use our grant funding in that, you know, kind of smart ways, really to steer towards impact, I think that we can have more results and more gender and climate effects. And this is just one example. We duplicate that also for example, energy transition. Because if you look at safe water enterprises, the energy bills weigh very heavily on the enterprises. So if you want to reduce that and you incentivize them through transitioning from fossil to solar-based energy, it will reduce their bills and it will also have a climate effect. So there are multiple examples, and we do that through incentive payments, really to create those impacts.
Yeah, so very targeted incentives in order to create the right impact. Thank you. I don't know if the panelists have had a chance to see the question from Tanvi. I think it's a great question. What's the impact of COVID on women-owned businesses in general? So, for example, in the US, women's participation in the labor force fell. Women-owned businesses have reported a noticeable decline in their health. And it sort of goes back to the social norms issue, where women were really, the caregiver focus came out. So has similar impact been felt across the world? And how do we do things differently in the future so that shocks don't set women back? I guess this is not just for water, it's women-owned businesses in general, but because we are in different parts of the world, I think it would be great to hear the responses on this. Who would like to go first on this one? Zoni, would you like to go first?
Sure, but I actually was hoping that I could sort of take a little bit of a shift to the question, because I think you know, it is true that women-owned businesses have been deeply impacted across the world and including in Asia. Particularly given that so many women in our region of the Asia Pacific are part of also the informal sector, and so, you know, the impact has of course been felt. But I wanted to kind of switch back to something that a couple of my fellow panelists talked about, which is on community and the importance of investing in communities, because this is something that will contribute to the resilience of women's livelihoods, including those that own businesses. And one of the things that we have been doing at ADB is that we've recently launched a community resilience partnership program. And the program is really to look at the nexus between climate, poverty, and gender at the local level. And we're working with a global women's organization called the Huairou Commission. And they do a lot of work with grassroots women's organizations. And the Community Resilience Partnership Fund has actually a dedicated envelope to work with community women and in targeted investments that put resources in community women's hands. So I think these types of interventions are really important because as we have seen, it is in times of crisis, it is women that mobilize in order to help their families and their communities be resilient to shocks, whether they're economic or climate related. And so I just wanted to share our experience in setting this up and also share that I think we need more of these sort of women-focused investments in resilience at the community level.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to add? Camilla or Yazin? On the COVID impact? Okay. I can.
Sorry,
probably
Vedika,
just,
I can.
Yeah,
oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Camilla.
Okay, well, so I can just say that it's definitely impact we all feel. It's women and men. We could see that in previous session when one of the speakers, we could hear his children in the background. I think it would be important to see how the data plays out. We already know women have higher exit rates from companies, from water companies. We got data recently from one of the companies during COVID, and the exit rates were really quite high and higher for women than men. This is costing companies. This is costly when your employees leave, because the cost of training new employees, finding new employees is much higher. So I think that's one. From Equal Aqua, we had a meet right when COVID pandemic started. We had a meeting and actually brought together our partners and had this discussion. And what we found is also there are so many responses that you can do as a utility organization, and some were very innovative, because in some cases they found that gender-based violence at home was a big issue, for example. And because you didn't have a space to get to, you were stuck at home under lockdown. So of course, and one of the utilities proposed a hotline and a secret keyword that you could give in a pharmacy to let someone know you are in trouble. So really innovative activities came out of it, and I think there is a lot we can do, but at the same time, data and research shows that these impacts are higher. And I'm noticing as we now review projects and we look at their gender actions, a lot more consideration is given to resilience part. And I would also just say that we had a recent report called Epic Response. It was a report on flooding and droughts, kind of in the governance systems. And one of the recommendations was, we need to give these social aspects equal weight. Let's look at technical solutions, but also social solutions, because that is very important. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I would just like to add a couple of points from India. So India has always had a very low percentage of, perhaps one of the lowest in terms of women in the formal workforce. But COVID did impact that, and the percentage participation dropped further. But this whole remote working and working, actually that has helped some women who had dropped out of the workforce because of young babies or whatever, or caregiving at home. They have actually rejoined because this remote working gives you the flexibility. And from our work at water.org, we've actually seen that while lending dramatically dropped during the first wave of COVID, but subsequently it's been increasing month on month by financial institutions for water and sanitation, because a lot of the demand is being driven by the women and in response to COVID, right? Because they don't want to go out to collect water. They don't want to go out every day for sanitation purposes, because it's just not safe. So actually we're seeing a lot more community-driven demand and really, again, driven by women. Yazin, there are a couple of questions for you.
Vedika, I saw the last one I read from Stephen, I think, and that is to do that there's also a huge financing need at the utility level, and that is a correct observation, of course. I think that the bigger utilities typically are being financed by organizations such as the World Bank, of course, through the governments, but they reach that kind of funding. And the smaller utilities, actually, we're looking at that as we speak in Kenya, because the smaller ones also identified a financing gap, and that has very often to do with non-revenue water or energy transition. And, although I am 100% sure that these trajectories can be financed with private capital, because we have done the calculations with 6 smaller utilities in Kenya, with 1 utility in Mali, with another utility in Zambia, we run into the problem of the fact that, for example, in Mali, we said we can even help you access a bank, find out, the details, etc., etc. The bank offered a 5-year loan to the utility for an energy transition project, in which, of course, after the loan has been paid off, the benefits of the energy transition still benefit the utility. The utility then responds, well, to us, this is very new. We have never ever attracted private capital. So thank you for your help, but we are going to wait for another grant to come by. And that is very disappointing because we know it can be done. It's the smart thing to do. It will allow many more, it will allow less losses. It will allow more household connections, etc. And still, so there are incentives in the market, especially when you look at utilities, that we need to discuss and we need to solve, because there's a huge opportunity and there's need. And luckily, the smaller utilities see that and have different incentives. So yes, indeed, we're putting a lot of effort, and thank you for that question. But at OECD and World Bank level, I think we need to pick up on this very important point.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm missing any other questions. I see some comments. I think, Yosine, there was a question from Ella for you.
Yeah, on K-Wash, wasn't it? If I see it quickly. And so thank you also for that question. We work on 2 levels with enterprises, and then we very carefully measure and calculate what the incentive payments need to be in order to achieve the right impact. When we talk about incentive payments for impact on financial institution level, we do not interfere with their client base. So we incentivize financial institutions to embrace water and sanitation through their liquidity provider. In this case, it's Action. So we also do not target them ourselves. We do it through the impact investor who wants to work with those institutions. And I think typically, what we do is also look at the portfolios of the financial institutions and see if there are opportunities for us to work with those enterprises, but we do not incentivize entrepreneurs through the financial institutions as we do with K-Wash. Maybe a little bit complicated, but please reach out to me and then we'll have more detailed discussion on this.
Thank you. And also thank you, Ella, for pointing out the USAID partnership, the Women in Water Alliance. Yep, we are very excited to be a part of that. And you're absolutely right. There is a robust evaluation coming up. So I think, Catherine, we are on time. And I was wondering if I could delegate the wrapping up to you, because I think there's just so much going on.
You're completely right. And you did such a great job steering us through that discussion. And the panelists, I think, did an excellent job highlighting all of these different interconnections between climate, water, women's empowerment, and also environmental justice. Obviously extremely complex, but I thought that was a fascinating discussion. I actually will have the privilege to hand off the real wrap up to Jennifer Sarah. So let me maybe just thank you again, Vedika, and all the panelists. We look forward to continuing this discussion, obviously hugely important, and it's so good to hear from so many women leaders on this topic. So thank you for that. And thank you for the great questions from participants and comments as well. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this session now, so we have time for the closing remarks of the roundtable meeting. And actually, we're really fortunate to have Jennifer Sarah on the line with us. She is known, of course, to many, many of you. She's the Global Director of the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. And of course, the World Bank is a very important partner with us in the Roundtable. So we're really fortunate to have her here. I'm happy to turn the floor over to her. Jennifer, are you ready to go?
I am, yeah.
Okay, oh, well, over to you.
So thank you so much. I mean, this is such a fascinating session. And on behalf of the World Bank, I'd really like to sincerely thank the OECD, the State Department, EPA, the World Water Council, the Dutch government, among all the other co-conveners for organizing this fascinating roundtable, and also to the presenters and participants for your passionate engagement. So Kathleen, you've given me the challenge to wrap this up in just 5 minutes, 2 very, very rich days of deliberation on such a critically important and complex topic, crowding in the much needed financing for water to meet our SDGs as well as our climate action goals, and also to propose a forward vision. But first of all, I think it's important that I reiterate the urgency and enormity of the challenge we are facing. We've heard that from all of our speakers. And we know that the global community must drastically change course to stick to the 1.5 degree threshold agreed in Paris. And unfortunately, last month's IPCC report just shows us that we're actually on a catastrophic path towards a 2.7 degree warming if we don't do something about it. And so that actually has to guide everything we do. So combating climate change is everyone's business. But we also heard from our speakers that the water sector has a particularly important role to play. And as climate warming is increasing our water scarcity and variability, it's affecting all of our economic activities, including in food and energy production, manufacturing, and infrastructure development. And so that's why managing this variability is key to our adaptation efforts. But also how we manage water is central to the climate change mitigation efforts, and several speakers spoke to that. Water services are often very emissive, they're very energy hungry, they're inefficient, they waste a lot of energy. So while climate change manifests itself primarily through the changes in the water cycle, some of the solutions actually run through water, including on the side of mitigation. But coming to the theme of financing water, investments that contribute to water security are essential for adapting to climate change, but also to deliver the SDG 6. And I'm really happy at the last session, when we looked at SDG 6, this is about people. This is providing services to men, boys, girls, women, right? Universal access to water and sanitation. So let's also not forget that, that's front and straight. And so 3 issues I want to quickly speak to. One is the political agenda. And on the political side, we just are not getting the political leadership nor the investment needed to address these growing water crises. And over the years, many of us have been working together tirelessly to try to galvanize the political action, to bring in the evidence through high levels panels, raising the awareness on the importance of valuing water, through sessions at the COP events, and we'll have another COP coming up in November, to continue to bring the linkage between water and climate change, sidelines of the UN General Assembly with the private sector, with the private sector being both water users as well as investors in water. And then finally, at the outset of the COVID pandemic, wash your hands, we're all, aha, finally the world's gonna get it, right? We're gonna get the investment we need in here. People will bring the political leadership. Unfortunately, we're not seeing this happening. We have to think a little bit why. Why are we not able to crowd in the additional investment and financing? And this is the second point I think is, let's go back to the basics. How do we attract the UN estimated gap of $2.5 trillion needed, 2.5 trillion needed just to achieve SDG 6 in developing countries? And so as we talk to investors, and as we heard today from many of them, we have a clear understanding what's needed to attract the financing, be it public or private. First is supporting governments put in place sound regulatory and policy environments to gain investor confidence. We need to also continue with the fundamentals of building transparent, inclusive of women and men, creditworthy and accountable utilities and service providers. Keep on innovating and looking for new sources of financing, microcredit guarantees, risk mitigation instruments. Increase the number of bankable projects, and also thinking through programs at scale where you can crowd in blended finance and identify and share risks across a number of investors. And most importantly, several speakers spoke to this, is to really promote the need for properly valuing water, pricing water, and where needed, having well-targeted subsidies that we can ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind. So lastly, going forward, I really want to urge us all to continue to work together to move into a solution space. I thought it was fantastic today that we're talking to other financial institutions, to rating agencies, to central banks. That's really, really important for us to develop these innovative approaches. And I think very, very importantly, what I heard also is that we need to talk to people outside of water. We need to talk to people in the sectors that are very, very water exposed, in agriculture and food and energy, in industry and jobs. So that might be a really interesting conversation because they're the ones who need to mitigate these risks. How will we do it? And how do we join forces with them and learn from them? Secondly, Kathleen and OECD and all the great work you're doing is to continue to innovate and build and mainstream innovative financing mechanisms, structured blended finance, impact bonds, carbon financing, maybe climate blue bonds, green climate funds. How do we put all this together? And we know how difficult it is to attract the water sector, the financing into the water sector. So let's keep on helping countries and cities develop credible, bankable projects. And it's possible. And I just want to give one little example. It's just last month, it took us years and years of supporting Angola and the city of Luanda, just to put in place a policy environment that could attract private investment to build up the utility. But just last month, Standard Chartered announced a 1.1 billion financing for the government of Angola for a water supply project in Luanda. And this is supporting a much, much smaller loan by the World Bank. So there are success stories. I think we should share the success stories much, much more, because then we can learn and build. Success brings more success. So let me wrap up again and thank everyone for all the presenters over the last 2 days. To reiterate how important the World Bank looks forward to continuing to collaborate with all of you as we make the ambitious and necessary investments in water security, noting it's not just good climate policy, but an opportunity to invest in people and jobs and investments that will spur long-term economic growth while protecting our planet. So it's investments in our collective future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jennifer. That was amazing, and a very perfect way to wrap up this roundtable. That was a tour de force. So thank you to you and to everybody who joined us, and we'll look forward to taking these messages out to beyond the usual water community, and look forward to the next time we can see you and collaborate on this. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Bye-bye.